April 9th, 1241, southeast of the city of Legnica in the Duchy of Silesia. The morning mist hung low over the Polish countryside as Duke Henry II, known to his subjects as Henry the Pious, led his army onto the field at Legnicy Pole. Behind him rode the flower of European chivalry, Polish knights in their mail hauberks, German nobles who had answered the call to defend Christendom, Bavarian gold miners from Goldburg, clutching their tools as weapons, and among them a small contingent of men who represented the pinnacle of medieval military prowess, Knights Templar, veterans of the Crusades, men who had fought the Saracens in the scorching deserts of the Holy Land and lived to tell the tale. Somewhere between 68 and 88 of them had journeyed from France to help defend Christian Europe against a threat that seemed to have materialized from the depths of hell itself. The Mongols, the Tartars, as Europeans called them, believing they had emerged from Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld. For weeks, these horsemen from the endless steppes of Asia had carved a path of destruction through Poland. Lublin had fallen, Sandomierz had been sacked after surrendering, its population slaughtered. Krakow, the ancient capital, had been burned on Palm Sunday just 16 days earlier. Now, as Duke Henry surveyed the field before him, he knew that his army of roughly 25,000 to 30,000 men was all that stood between the Mongol horde and the complete conquest of Central Europe. One day's march away, King Wenceslas of Bohemia advanced with 50,000 fresh troops. If Henry could hold for just one more day, reinforcements would arrive. If he retreated behind the walls of Legnica, he could wait in safety. But Henry had made his choice. He would not wait. He could not wait. The Mongols were ravaging his lands, burning his villages, killing his people. Every hour of delay meant more destruction. So Henry had marched out to meet them, dividing his forces into 4 groups. The Bavarian miners led by Bolesław of Moravia formed the first. Conscripts from Greater Poland and Krakow under Sulisław comprised the second. The army from a Pole under Duke Mieszko the Fat made up the third, and Henry himself commanded the 4th group, the strongest, which included his Silesian knights, Moravian nobles, mercenaries, and the Knights Templar. Across the field, perhaps 20,000 Mongol warriors waited under the command of Princes Baidar and Kaidan. They had not come to conquer Poland. That was never the plan. The invasion of Poland was a diversion, a feint on a strategic scale that would have made Sun Tzu himself nod in appreciation. The real target was Hungary, where the main Mongol army under Batu Khan prepared to destroy King Bela IV. But the Hungarian king had allies. Polish forces might march south to reinforce him. Bohemian armies might intervene. So General Subutai, one of the greatest military minds in human history, had devised a plan of elegant brutality. Send a smaller force into Poland, destroy its armies, spread terror, keep the northern kingdoms too paralyzed with fear and too devastated by loss to help anyone else. Then, when Hungary lay in ruins, return home with the spoils. The Mongols who faced Henry that morning were not the largest army their empire could muster, but they were more than sufficient for the task at hand. Every warrior had trained from childhood in the saddle. Every man could shoot a composite bow with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Every unit had drilled in complex maneuvers that European armies couldn't even comprehend, let alone execute. They were organized into arbands of 10 men, Jaguns of 100, Mingans of 1,000, and Tumans of 10,000. Each level of command could operate independently, yet remained coordinated through a sophisticated system of flags, drums, and mounted messengers. This was not a rabble. This was a military machine precision-engineered for one purpose: victory. The Templar Knights who would face them that day had their own impressive credentials. Founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon had evolved into the most elite fighting force in Christendom. They were warrior monks who combined religious devotion with military discipline in a way that no secular army could match. While other knights might break formation to pursue glory or plunder, Templars obeyed orders. While other warriors might flee when the battle turned against them, Templars fought to the death. Their white mantles emblazoned with the Red Cross had become symbols of both hope and terror across the Mediterranean world. They were among the best-funded warriors in Europe, equipped with the finest armour money could buy. By 1241, A wealthy Templar Knight would have worn a mail hauberk, a long-sleeved shirt of interlocking iron rings that covered his body from neck to knees. Some of the more prominent knights had begun adding iron plates to their mail for extra protection. A great helm protected the head, a massive steel bucket that enclosed the face entirely, with only narrow slits for vision. Underneath, a coif of mail protected the neck. Mail chausses covered the legs. Leather gloves with mail backs protected the hands. The knight's primary weapons were the lance and sword. The lance was a massive thrusting weapon, 3.5 to 4.5 meters long, designed to be couched under the arm and driven through an enemy by the combined momentum of horse and rider. The sword was straight, double-edged, with a blade 80 to 120 centimeters long, weighing between 1 and 1.8 kilograms. It could cut, thrust, and crush. Axes, maces, and horsemen's picks provided additional options for close combat. The knight's warhorse, by the 13th century, was itself often protected by mail barding. These were not the massive draft horses of later centuries, but they were large, powerful animals bred specifically for war. They had been trained from foalhood to charge into combat, to kick and bite, to be living weapons. The total cost of equipping a single knight, including horse, armour, weapons, and supporting personnel, was astronomical. Each knight was typically accompanied by at least one squire, and often several servants, forming a unit called a lance. The Templars who rode onto the field at Legnica represented an investment of resources that most kingdoms could barely afford. And the Mongols were going to destroy them. The battle began, as Mongol battles always did, with deception. A lightly armed vanguard of Mongol horsemen advanced toward Duke Henry's forces. They appeared to be probing, testing, looking for weaknesses. The European infantry, including Henry's archers, loosed volleys at the approaching riders. The range was long, but some arrows found their marks. Mongols tumbled from their saddles. Others wheeled their horses about, seemingly in confusion. Then, suddenly, the entire Mongol vanguard turned and fled. It was the oldest trick in the Mongol playbook, the feigned retreat. Europeans would later encounter it again and again, and it would fool them every single time. The psychology of it was perfect. Knights trained from birth to charge, to close with the enemy, to prove their courage and win glory in close combat. When they saw the enemy fleeing before them, every instinct screamed to pursue. Duke Henry, watching his enemy apparently break and run, made the decision that sealed his fate. He ordered his knights to charge. The Silesian cavalry, including the Templars, spurred their horses forward. Behind them, the other sections of Henry's army began to advance as well. The knights accelerated into a thundering charge, lances lowered, the earth shaking beneath thousands of iron-shod hooves. They were the ultimate military force of medieval Europe, heavily armoured shock cavalry capable of smashing through any formation that stood before them. For 2 centuries they had been virtually unstoppable. They were about to learn that war had changed. As the European knights charged after the fleeing Mongols, they began to string out. The fastest horses pulled ahead. Formation coherence, never a strong point of medieval European armies, began to deteriorate. The knights at the front couldn't see what was happening behind them. The commanders had no way to communicate with their scattered forces, and then the Mongols released their trap. From multiple directions, concealed Mongol units emerged. Fresh warriors on fresh horses, moving at incredible speed, began to encircle the advancing Europeans. The fleeing vanguard suddenly wheeled about, composite bows in hand, and then the arrows came. The Mongol composite bow was a masterpiece of engineering that had taken thousands of years to perfect. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued together with animal adhesives and shaped into a distinctive recurved form, it could store tremendous energy despite its compact size. A Mongol warrior could draw and loose arrows while riding at full gallop, steering his horse with his knees, rising in his stirrups to get a clear shot. The effective range of these bows exceeded anything the Europeans possessed. The Mongols could stand off at 300 yards and pour accurate fire into enemy formations while remaining completely safe from return fire, and that's exactly what they did. Wave after wave of arrows fell on the European knights. Most bounced off armour or shields. Mail was good protection against arrows at long range, but mail had weak points: the face, if the visor was raised, the joints, the backs of the knees, the armpits, and while individual arrows might not penetrate, the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming, hundreds of arrows falling every minute, thousands of arrows over the course of minutes. Eventually, by pure probability, some would find gaps in the armour. Men screamed as arrow points punched through mail rings and into flesh. But worse than the arrows aimed at the knights were the arrows aimed at their horses. Horses made bigger targets than men, and while war horses could be barded in armour, that armour was expensive and not universal. Many horses had only cloth covering or leather protection. An arrow through the eye, an arrow into the flank, an arrow that severed a tendon. A charging war horse suddenly stumbled, throwing its rider, or collapsed entirely, crushing the knight beneath half a ton of dying animal. A knight in full armour who fell from his horse was, if not helpless, then severely compromised. The armour that protected him also weighed him down. Getting to his feet was difficult. Fighting effectively on foot against mounted opponents was nearly impossible, and that's when the Mongol heavy cavalry came in. Not all Mongol warriors were light horse archers. The Mongols had developed their own heavy cavalry units, equipped with lances, sabres, and armour. They weren't as heavily armoured as European knights, using mostly felt and leather with some metal plates. But they didn't need to be. They were fighting dismounted or disorganised opponents. A Mongol lancer galloping at full speed, lance extended, could spear a struggling European knight before the man could even raise his sword in defence. As the Mongol encirclement tightened, Duke Henry's army began to disintegrate. The different sections, which had never been well coordinated to begin with, found themselves isolated and fighting for their lives. The Bavarian miners, brave but poorly equipped, were slaughtered. The conscripts from Greater Poland, armed with little more than farm implements, broke and ran. Many were run down and killed from behind as they fled. Duke Mieszko the Fat, commanding the third group, saw the disaster unfolding and made the only rational decision available to him. He fled the field with what forces he could gather, abandoning the rest of the army to its fate. The Mongols, according to some accounts, employed an additional weapon that day: smoke. Whether from burning grass, special incendiary devices, or early gunpowder-based rockets, a smoke screen drifted across the battlefield. It separated the European infantry from the cavalry that had charged ahead. The foot soldiers couldn't see what was happening to their mounted comrades. The knights, already disoriented by the Mongol tactics, now found themselves fighting blind, and in the smoke and chaos, according to the later chronicler Jan Długosz, Mongol warriors shouted commands in Polish: "Flee! Flee!" This was psychological warfare at its finest. Amid the smoke and confusion, European soldiers heard what they thought were orders from their own commanders. Units that might have held their ground instead broke and scattered, making themselves easy prey for the pursuing Mongols. In the centre of this maelstrom, the Knights Templar made their stand. The Templars were many things, but they were not cowards. Their rule forbade retreat unless outnumbered more than 3-1. Even then, permission to withdraw had to come from their commander. As long as the Boson, their distinctive black and white battle standard, still flew, Templars were required to fight. So they fought. These men had faced Muslim cavalry in the deserts of Outremer. They had survived sieges, ambushes, and pitched battles against some of the finest warriors Islam could produce. They were not going to be broken by horsemen from the steppes, no matter how many arrows filled the air. The Templars formed up, maintaining formation discipline that the rest of the European army lacked. They kept their ranks tight, presenting a smaller target. They covered each other with shields. They made the Mongols pay in blood for every yard of ground. And the Mongols did pay. Their tactics minimized casualties but didn't eliminate them. Mongol warriors fell to Templar lances and swords, but there were always more Mongols. The Mongol force, though smaller than Henry's army in total numbers, could concentrate overwhelming force at any point on the battlefield. Their superior mobility meant they could mass rapidly, strike hard, and withdraw before the Europeans could respond. They could attack from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing the Templars from forming a coherent defensive line. Arrows continued to fall. Mongol light cavalry darted in and out, loosing arrows, then retreating before the Templars could countercharge. When the Templars tried to form up for a coordinated charge of their own, Mongol heavy cavalry would feint an attack from a different direction, forcing them to turn and defend. Hour by hour, the Templar formation shrank. One by one, the white-mantled warriors fell, wounded, unhorsed, overwhelmed. According to later reports, the Templars were killed to a man. Whether this means every single Templar who fought at Legnica died, or whether it's an exaggeration born of medieval chroniclers' love of dramatic finality, We cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that the Templar Grand Master in France, Ponce d'Aubon, later reported to King Louis IX that the order had lost 500 people in Poland, including both the battle itself and subsequent Mongol raids on Templar holdings. Of these, 9 were brother knights, 3 were knights, and 2 were sergeants. The remaining casualties were likely support personnel, servants and peasants who worked Templar estates. These men weren't trained warriors, but they had been called to fight nonetheless, and they had died. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Duke Henry the Pious tried desperately to rally his forces. As the army collapsed around him, Henry made the decision to withdraw, to save what he could and retreat to Legnica's walls. He gathered 3 bodyguards and attempted to fight his way off the field. They almost made it. Mongol warriors spotted the Duke's party and gave chase. In the running fight that followed, Henry was struck in the arm by a spear. Unhorsed or unable to control his mount, he was quickly surrounded. He was killed and beheaded. The Mongols, following their custom of counting enemy dead, cut the right ear from each fallen European and collected them in sacks. According to medieval sources, they filled 9 sacks. If we assume a sack held a couple thousand ears, the European casualties would have numbered in the low tens of thousands. Modern historians estimate the actual death toll was between 2,000 and 40,000, with the true figure probably somewhere in the middle. Essentially, Duke Henry's entire army had been destroyed. After the battle, the Mongols displayed Henry's severed head on a spear and paraded it around the city of Legnica, a brutal demonstration of their victory and a warning to any who might still think of resisting them. King Wenceslas of Bohemia, who had been marching to link up with Henry, learned of the disaster and immediately halted his advance. With 50,000 men, Wenceslas theoretically had the strength to engage the Mongols, but he had just received a visceral demonstration of what happened when European armies fought Mongol forces in open battle. Wenceslas decided that defending his own kingdom of Bohemia was a higher priority than avenging Henry. He withdrew, taking his army with him. The road to Western Europe lay open. The Mongols could have continued their advance. They could have ravaged Bohemia. They could have swept into Germany, perhaps even into France. But they didn't. Instead, after thoroughly looting Silesia, Baydar and Khadan turned their armies south and east, rejoining the main Mongol force in Hungary. The mission was complete. Poland had been neutralized as a potential threat. No Polish army would be marching to help the Hungarians, and 2 days after, Legnica at the Battle of Mohi, the Mongols demonstrated that Legnica was no fluke. The Hungarian army, even larger than Henry's, was utterly destroyed in a battle that showcased the same tactical brilliance and brutal effectiveness. For medieval Europeans, Legnica was a trauma that echoed for generations. How had it happened? How had the finest warriors in Christendom, including the legendary Knights Templar, been so thoroughly defeated? The answer lay in the fundamental differences between European and Mongol warfare. European combat in 1241 was still deeply rooted in traditions that stretched back centuries. War was the business of aristocrats. Knights fought for honour, for glory, for their share of ransom and plunder. Battles were won by courage, by individual prowess, by the righteous fury of Christian warriors blessed by God. Tactics, in the modern sense, barely existed. A typical European battle plan consisted of dividing forces into a few large groups and having them charge the enemy. Communication during battle was almost non-existent. Once the fighting started, commanders had essentially no control over their forces. Knights often acted independently, seeking personal glory rather than following any unified strategy. This system had worked reasonably well when everyone was using the same approach. A battle between 2 European armies was essentially a giant melee. The side with more knights and more determination usually won. But the Mongols played a completely different game. Mongol warfare was the product of centuries of refinement on the Central Asian steppes. It was based on hunting techniques developed to corner and kill dangerous prey across vast territories. Mongol boys learned to ride before they could walk. They practiced archery from early childhood, graduating from small bows to larger, more powerful weapons as they grew. By the time a Mongol warrior reached adulthood, he had spent his entire life training for war. Mongol military organization was decimal and hierarchical, allowing for both flexibility and control. Orders could be passed rapidly through the chain of command. Units could operate independently when necessary, but remained coordinated with the overall battle plan. The Mongols had developed a sophisticated signalling system using flags and banners. Different colours and patterns conveyed different orders. A Mongol general positioned on high ground could observe the entire battlefield and send orders to his subordinate commanders, who would then direct their units accordingly. This level of battlefield control was something European armies wouldn't achieve for centuries. Mongol tactics emphasized mobility, missile fire, and deception. Rather than closing immediately with the enemy, Mongol forces would maintain distance, using their superior bows to inflict casualties while remaining out of reach. Feigned retreats would draw impetuous enemies into ambushes. Flanking maneuvers would surround and isolate enemy formations. The Nerge, the great hunting circle technique used to drive game into killing zones, scaled up perfectly to military operations, and perhaps most importantly, Mongol warfare was utterly pragmatic. There was no concept of fighting fairly, or proving courage through close combat. The goal was victory with minimum casualties to your own forces. If that meant shooting fleeing enemies in the back, so be it. If it meant using terror to make future enemies surrender without fighting, even better. For the Knights Templar specifically, Legnica must have been a uniquely frustrating experience. Everything they had trained for, everything that had made them so effective in the Crusades, proved worse than useless against Mongol tactics. In the Holy Land, Templar heavy cavalry charges could shatter Muslim formations. The psychological impact of armoured knights thundering forward was often enough to break enemy morale. In the confined spaces of Middle Eastern battlefields, with rivers, cities, and rough terrain limiting manoeuvre room, the Templars' shock tactics could be decisive. But at Legnica, there was nothing to shock. The Mongols simply refused to receive the charge. They dispersed, shot arrows, and moved away. The Templars' heavy armour, their powerful war horses, their disciplined formations, none of it mattered when they couldn't bring their weapons to bear on an enemy who wouldn't stand and fight. And when the Mongols did close to melee range, it was on their terms, with the Templars already disorganised and separated from supporting forces. The Templars must have realised in those final minutes that they were facing something unprecedented. These were not the Muslims they had fought for decades. These were not even human in the way Europeans understood humanity. The Mongols seemed like demons, appearing and disappearing in the smoke, loosing endless arrows, immune to the conventional rules of warfare. When Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a papal envoy who travelled to the Mongol court in the years after Legnica, later wrote about Mongol tactics, he described them as fighting, not by pressing close, but by flight and return, by cunning more than force. It was an alien way of war, and medieval Europe had no answer for it. In the aftermath of Legnica, panic spread across Europe. Letters flew between capitals. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade against the Mongols. Kings and princes prepared defences and sent out desperate calls for information. Who were these invaders? Where had they come from? How could they be stopped? Thomas Berard, who became Grand Master of the Knights Templar a few years after Legnica, wrote about the terrible and awesome arrival of the Tartars in letters to Templar officials in England. The fear in his words is palpable. The Mongols seemed unstoppable. But then, almost inexplicably, they stopped themselves. In late 1241, news reached the Mongol commanders in Hungary that Ögedei Khan, the great Khan and son of Genghis Khan, had died. According to Mongol law, a Kurultai, a gathering of the empire's leaders, had to be held to elect the next Khan. The Mongol forces in Europe, still undefeated, still in possession of most of Hungary, began to withdraw. Some historians have argued that Ögedei's death was merely an excuse, that the Mongols had already decided that conquering and holding Western Europe wasn't practical, given the logistical challenges and the lack of good pasture land for their horses. Others point out that Batu Khan, the overall commander in Europe, didn't actually return to Mongolia for several years after Ögedei's death, suggesting politics rather than law drove his withdrawal. Whatever the reason, the Mongols left. They took their plunder, their captives, and their terrifying reputation, and they returned east. Poland and Hungary would be raided multiple times in the following decades, but never again would the Mongols mount a serious attempt to conquer Central Europe. For the Knights Templar, Legnica became a black mark in their history. It wasn't that they had fought poorly or displayed cowardice. By all accounts, they had fought bravely and to the death, but they had lost. The aura of invincibility that surrounded the military orders had been shattered. If even the Templars could be destroyed by these horse archers from the steppes, what hope did anyone else have? The battle's lessons were difficult for medieval Europeans to absorb because they challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare and nobility. The Mongol victory suggested that individual courage mattered less than tactics and organisation. It suggested that heavy cavalry, the foundation of European military power, could be defeated by lighter, more mobile forces. It suggested that the way Europeans had been fighting wars for centuries was fundamentally flawed. But change came slowly. The feudal system that produced knights was deeply embedded in European society. Noblemen derived their status and power from their role as warriors. Suggesting that peasant archers might be more militarily effective than armoured knights was not just a tactical question, it was a threat to the entire social order. So Europe largely ignored the lessons of Legnica. Over the next century, European armies would suffer similar defeats to mounted archers and other mobile forces. At Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, English longbowmen would slaughter French knights, who insisted on charging headlong into missile fire. At Bannockburn, Scottish infantry would destroy English cavalry. Again and again the pattern repeated. But slowly, inevitably, European warfare did evolve. Gunpowder weapons began to appear, rendering armour obsolete. Professional infantry armed with pikes and firearms replaced aristocratic cavalry as the core of armies. Tactical sophistication increased as commanders realised that winning battles required more than courage and steel. By the 16th century, European armies had developed the combined arms tactics that would make them formidable opponents. Formations like the Spanish tercio, which integrated pike, sword and arquebus infantry into a mutually supporting whole, proved devastatingly effective. Artillery, once crude and unreliable, became a battlefield game-changer. The military revolution was underway, and European armies would ultimately become the most powerful military forces on Earth. But in 1241, at a field southeast of Legnica, the Knights Templar and their Polish allies learned a harsh lesson about the limits of courage and steel. They fought bravely, they died honourably. And they were completely, utterly defeated by an enemy who played by different rules and fought a different kind of war. The Mongols would eventually retreat from Europe, their empire would fragment, and their threat would fade. But they had proven something important. The age of the knight as the ultimate military force was already ending, even if Europeans didn't want to admit it. The future belonged to armies that combined mobility, firepower, and sophisticated tactics. The Mongols had that combination. Medieval Europe didn't, not yet. And at Legnica, the price of that gap was measured in thousands of lives and 9 sacks of severed ears. Today, the Battle of Legnica is commemorated on the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw, with the inscription Legnica 9/4/1241. It stands as a reminder of one of medieval Poland's darkest days, when the flower of European chivalry rode out to defend Christendom and met an enemy they couldn't defeat. For the Knights Templar specifically, Legnica was one of many disasters they would suffer over the coming decades. In 1291 they would lose Acre, their last major stronghold in the Holy Land. In 1307 the order would be suppressed by Pope Clement V, under pressure from King Philip IV of France. Its members arrested, its assets seized, its Grand Master burned at the stake, but that still lay in the future. On April 9th, 1241, the Templars who fought at Legnica knew nothing of the order's eventual fate. They knew only that they faced an implacable enemy, that their duty demanded they fight, and that retreat was not an option. So they formed their ranks, lowered their lances, and charged into history. What happened to them that day is what happens to any army. No matter how brave, no matter how elite, when it faces an enemy with superior tactics and refuses to adapt, they were destroyed. Not because they lacked courage, not because they fought poorly, but because courage alone has never been enough to win battles. The Mongols understood that. Medieval Europe was still learning it, and the lesson was written in blood on the fields of Legnica. The survivors of Legnica carried their trauma back to their homelands, bearing tales that seemed too terrible to believe. Among them were the knights who had fled with Duke Meshko the Fat, men who would spend the rest of their lives wrestling with the guilt of survival while their comrades died. They spoke of arrows that fell like rain, of horsemen who appeared and vanished like ghosts, of an enemy that fought without honour and won without mercy. In the monasteries and castles of Europe, scholars and soldiers tried to make sense of what had happened. How could the Mongols, who Europeans initially dismissed as barbarian rabble, defeat armies led by experienced commanders and blessed by the Church? The answers they came up with revealed more about European prejudices than Mongol realities. Some claimed the Mongols had won through sorcery, that they had called upon demons to conjure the smoke that blinded Christian warriors. Others insisted the Mongols were a punishment from God, sent to chastise Europe for its sins. The Book of Revelation spoke of armies from the east in the end times. Perhaps the Mongols were harbingers of the apocalypse. A few observers came closer to the truth. Giovanni da Piandelcarpine, who actually travelled to the Mongol capital and observed their society firsthand, wrote detailed accounts of Mongol military organisation and tactics. He noted their discipline, their training regimen, their strategic sophistication. He warned that any European army facing the Mongols would need to adopt similar methods or face annihilation. His warnings were largely ignored. The political aftermath of Legnica rippled across Europe for years. Poland, already fragmented into competing duchies, was further weakened. The death of Duke Henry II, who had been working to reunify Polish lands, set back Polish consolidation by decades. His widow, Anna of Bohemia, erected a chapel on the battlefield and established a Benedictine monastery there to pray for the souls of the fallen. The site became a pilgrimage destination for those mourning loved ones lost in the battle. Henry's body, missing its head, was identified by his widow through a unique feature. He had been born with 6 toes on his left foot. When the headless corpse was brought before Anna, she examined the feet and confirmed the identification through this deformity. The Duke was buried in the Church of St. Vincent in Roscoe, where his tomb became a site of veneration. Henry was later declared a saint by some local religious authorities, though never officially canonized by Rome. The Mongol invasion fundamentally altered the trajectory of Central European development. Poland and Hungary, both devastated by the campaigns of 1241, required decades to recover. The destruction of manpower, the burning of cities, the disruption of trade routes, all of this set back economic and political development at a crucial moment in European history. Had the Mongols not invaded, Poland might have reunified earlier and emerged as a more powerful player in European politics. Hungary might have expanded its influence in the Balkans. Instead, both nations spent the next generation simply rebuilding. The psychological impact was equally profound. For medieval Europeans, warfare had always been dangerous, but it followed certain rules. Knights might kill each other in battle, but they could also surrender and be ransomed. Cities might be besieged, but they could negotiate terms. There was a framework, brutal as it often was, that made war comprehensible. The Mongols shattered that framework. They didn't ransom prisoners, they enslaved or killed them. They didn't negotiate terms, they demanded absolute surrender or total destruction. They didn't fight according to European concepts of honour, they fought to win with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to themselves. This was warfare as a science rather than an art, as a practical tool of statecraft rather than a test of individual virtue. It was, in short, modern warfare arriving centuries early. And medieval Europe was completely unprepared for it. The Knights Templar in the wake of Legnica had to grapple with their own mortality in ways they hadn't before. In the Holy Land, Templars had suffered defeats and even catastrophic losses. But those defeats came at the hands of Muslim armies who fought in ways Europeans understood. Cavalry charges, siege warfare, battles over fortified positions. The rules were familiar even when the outcome was unfavourable. Mongol warfare was different. It rendered many of the Templars' advantages meaningless. Their heavy armour, a liability that slowed them down without protecting against the volume of arrows, their powerful war horses, vulnerable targets that the Mongols shot out from under them, their disciplined formations, irrelevant when the enemy refused to meet them head-on. Their religious conviction that God favoured the righteous in battle, shattered when righteous Christian warriors died by the hundreds, while pagan horsemen rode away unscathed. The Templar leadership tried to extract lessons from the disaster. Reports were compiled, tactics were discussed, adjustments were proposed, but the fundamental problem remained. The Templars were a heavy cavalry force designed to fight in the Levant against Muslim armies. Retooling them to fight Mongol horse archers would require abandoning everything that made them Templars. They were not going to do that, so instead they focused on what they could control: fortress defence, which remained relevant, naval operations in the Mediterranean, where Mongol cavalry couldn't follow, intelligence gathering and diplomacy, playing the political games that might prevent future Mongol invasions, and they prayed that they would never have to face the Mongols in open battle again. That prayer was answered, though not in the way anyone expected. The Mongol withdrawal from Europe after 1241 wasn't a strategic retreat in preparation for another assault. It was an ending. The empire's expansion westward had reached its limit, not because European defences had stopped it, but because the Mongols themselves lost interest. The death of Ugadei Khan in December 1241 triggered a succession crisis that consumed Mongol attention for years. Batu Khan, who had commanded the European campaign, established his own Khanate, the Golden Horde, in the Russian steppes. He was more interested in consolidating power there than in conquering distant European lands. Subsequent great Khans focused on other frontiers. Mungke Khan prioritized the conquest of Song China. Kublai Khan completed that conquest and then tried, unsuccessfully, to add Japan to the empire. Hulagu Khan destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and pushed into the Middle East, where he finally met defeat at the hands of the Mamluks at the Battle of Ainjalut in 1260. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, gradually fragmented into competing khanates. The unity that had made the invasion of Europe possible dissolved into rivalry and eventually open warfare between the different Mongol successor states. Europe, which had seemed on the brink of conquest in 1241, was saved not by its military prowess but by Mongol family politics and strategic priorities elsewhere. Yet the fear lingered. For generations, Europeans lived with the knowledge that somewhere to the east, beyond the vast forests and steppes, there existed a military power that had defeated their best armies with contemptuous ease. Chronicles from the decades after Legnica show this anxiety. Writers obsessively catalogued Mongol customs, trying to understand these strange invaders. Wild stories circulated. The Mongols ate human flesh. They could shoot arrows backward while fleeing at full speed. A single Mongol warrior could defeat 10 European knights. Some of these stories were exaggerations or complete fabrications, but the one about shooting arrows backward while fleeing, that was absolutely true. It was called the Parthian shot, named after the ancient Parthians who had used the same technique against Roman legions. A Mongol horseman could twist in his saddle and loose arrows at pursuers while his horse galloped away. It was devastatingly effective against enemies foolish enough to chase fleeing Mongols, which is to say, against most of their enemies. The tactical lessons of Legnica slowly, very slowly, began to influence European military thinking. Some commanders recognized that heavy cavalry, for all its shock power, had limitations. Experiments with combined arms tactics increased. Infantry, particularly missile infantry armed with crossbows and later longbows, received more respect and better training. The English in particular seemed to learn from the Mongol example, though probably independently. Their tactical system, which used dismounted knights and men-at-arms as heavy infantry, to anchor defensive positions while longbowmen devastated enemy cavalry with missile fire, bore a conceptual resemblance to Mongol tactics. Of course, the English didn't have the mobility of Mongol horse archers, but the principle of using missile fire to disrupt and destroy charging cavalry was similar. When English armies annihilated French chivalry at Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415, they were demonstrating what the Mongols had proven at Legnica more than a century earlier. Courage and heavy armour couldn't overcome tactical superiority and effective use of missile weapons. The French, like the Poles before them, kept charging into arrow storms and kept dying. It would take the French decades to adapt, just as it had taken Europe decades to process the Mongol invasions, but military evolution is often driven by defeat, and defeats as catastrophic as Legnica and Crécy eventually force change. The rise of gunpowder weapons in the 14th and 15th centuries completed the transformation that the Mongols had begun. Early firearms were crude and unreliable, but they had one overwhelming advantage. A peasant with a few weeks of training could use an arquebus to kill a knight who had spent his entire life training for war. The social and military implications were revolutionary. If commoners with guns could defeat aristocrats in armour, then the entire feudal system, which justified noble privilege through noble military service, was called into question. The transition wasn't immediate. Knights didn't disappear overnight. But gradually, inexorably, the nature of European warfare changed. Professional infantry replaced aristocratic cavalry as the core of armies. Artillery became the decisive arm in siege warfare. Tactics grew more sophisticated as commanders learned to coordinate different types of troops in complex maneuvers. By the 16th century, European armies had evolved into something the Mongols of 1241 would have recognized as formidable opponents. The Spanish tercios, combining pikemen, swordsmen and arquebusiers in flexible formations, could deliver both shock power and sustained firepower. They could defend against cavalry charges, assault enemy positions, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The Dutch and Swedes would refine these concepts further, developing systematic drill, professional officer corps, and sophisticated logistics. European armies of the 17th century featured the organizational discipline and tactical flexibility that had been Mongol hallmarks in the 13th. In a sense, Europe finally absorbed the lessons of Legnica, but it took 400 years. The Knights Templar never got the chance to apply any lessons they might have learned. By 1307, the order had been destroyed, its members arrested on charges of heresy, its assets seized by European monarchs greedy for the Templars' wealth. The charges were almost certainly false, fabrications produced under torture to justify the suppression of an organization that had become inconveniently powerful and wealthy. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314, proclaiming the order's innocence with his dying breath. The Templars who died at Legnica in 1241 had no idea their order had less than 70 years remaining. They thought they were fighting to defend Christendom against pagan invaders, part of an eternal struggle that would continue until Christ's return. Instead, they were fighting in one of the last major engagements where the medieval military system they represented still seemed viable. The future belonged to professional armies, gunpowder weapons, and nation-states. The age of warrior monks and crusading orders was ending. The Battle of Legnica itself faded from popular memory in Western Europe, overshadowed by more famous conflicts. The 100 Years' War, the Italian Wars, the religious wars of the Reformation, all of these captured more attention in European consciousness than a battle fought in Poland against an enemy who never returned. But in Poland and Central Europe, Legnica remained significant. It was remembered as a moment of heroic sacrifice, when Polish and Allied forces stood against overwhelming odds to defend Christian civilization. The fact that they lost didn't diminish the heroism. If anything, it enhanced it. Duke Henry the Pious became a symbol of selfless leadership, a ruler who died fighting for his people rather than fleeing to safety. Modern historians view Legnica through a different lens. It's seen as a case study in tactical asymmetry, a demonstration of what happens when two military systems with fundamentally different doctrines collide. The Mongols had developed their military system over centuries on the Eurasian steppes, refining it through constant warfare against numerous opponents. By 1241 they had achieved something close to tactical perfection for the technology available. European military systems had evolved in different circumstances. Feudal armies were designed for low-intensity conflicts between rival lords, for sieges of castles and raids on enemy territories. Large-scale pitched battles were relatively rare. The tactics that worked in these contexts, the reliance on heavy cavalry, the emphasis on individual prowess made perfect sense for European conditions, but they failed catastrophically when applied against Mongol forces. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. A military system that is highly effective in its native context proves inadequate when facing an enemy from a different tradition. Colonial-era European forces with firearms and artillery overwhelmed opponents who still relied on traditional weapons, but those same European forces sometimes suffered defeats when facing enemies who had adapted to local conditions and developed appropriate counter-tactics. In the 20th century, technologically sophisticated armies repeatedly struggled against insurgents and guerrilla forces who refused to fight conventional battles. The fundamental lesson of Legnica is that there is no single best way to fight. Military effectiveness is always contextual, always dependent on the specific conditions of terrain, technology, culture, and opponent. The Knights Templar were superb warriors for the conflicts they normally faced. They were poorly suited for fighting Mongols on open plains. That didn't make them bad soldiers. It made them soldiers in the wrong place at the wrong time. If we could somehow transport the Templar contingent from Legnica to a siege of a Crusader castle in the Holy Land, they would likely perform magnificently. Their skills, their equipment, their tactical training, All of it would be appropriate for that context. But at Legnica, they were fish out of water, armed and armoured for a battle that never happened, trying to fight in a way their enemy simply wouldn't allow. The Mongols, for their part, showed the strengths and limitations of their system. On open terrain against enemies who could be drawn into traps and encircled, they were nearly invincible. Against fortified positions defended by determined garrisons, they were far less effective. The Mongols besieged numerous cities during their European campaign, but many held out or forced negotiated surrenders. The Mongols were excellent at field warfare, adequate at siege warfare, and completely dependent on pasture land for their horses. This last factor may have been the ultimate limitation on Mongol expansion westward. Western Europe simply didn't have the vast grasslands that Mongol armies needed to keep tens of thousands of horses fed. The further west the Mongols advanced, the more they would have to rely on fodder rather than grazing, and the harder it would become to maintain their cavalry forces. Some historians argue this logistical constraint, more than any European military capability, ultimately saved Western Europe from conquest. We'll never know for certain, because the Mongols withdrew before reaching that limit. But it's plausible that an attempt to conquer France and Germany would have foundered on the practical problem of feeding the horses. In the end, the Battle of Legnica was a footnote in Mongol history, but a catastrophe for Poland and a trauma for Europe. For the Mongols, it was just another victory in a campaign that was itself just a diversion from their main strategic objective. The commanders who won at Legnica probably spent more time planning the invasion of Hungary than they did thinking about the Polish battle. But for Europeans, Legnica was a revelation. It demonstrated that the military superiority Europeans assumed they possessed was illusory. It showed that courage and faith were not enough to guarantee victory. It proved that there existed warriors in the world who could defeat European knights as easily as those knights defeated peasant levies. The psychological impact of that realization cannot be overstated. Medieval European society was built on the assumption that armoured knights were the ultimate military force, that the nobility's privilege was justified by their military function. The Mongol invasions called that assumption into question. If the best European warriors could be slaughtered by Asian horse archers, what did that say about the European social order? The question was too dangerous to pursue seriously. So instead, Europeans told themselves comforting stories about Mongol sorcery and divine punishment, about how the Mongols had won through trickery rather than true military skill. It was easier to believe that than to confront the uncomfortable truth. The uncomfortable truth was that European military systems in the mid-13th century were obsolete by Mongol standards. European commanders had no concept of the sophisticated tactics and operational art that Mongol generals employed as a matter of course. European armies couldn't communicate effectively on the battlefield, couldn't coordinate complex maneuvers, couldn't adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The Mongols could do all of these things. They had developed a military culture that emphasized learning from experience, studying opponents, and constantly refining tactics. When they encountered a new enemy, they would often lose the first engagement while they figured out that enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Then they would adapt and win the subsequent battles. The problem for Europeans was that the Mongols already had extensive experience fighting heavy cavalry. They had faced Persian, Arab, and Chinese cavalry forces before invading Europe. European knights were just another variant of armoured horsemen, and the Mongols already knew how to defeat armoured horsemen. They had the tactics, the training, and the discipline to implement those tactics flawlessly. Duke Henry and the Knights Templar never had a chance. They were brave, they were skilled, they were well equipped. But they were fighting an enemy who had already solved the problem they represented. From the Mongol perspective, Legnica wasn't even particularly challenging. It was just another application of proven tactics against a predictable opponent. The European cavalry did exactly what Mongol generals expected them to do. They charged, and charging cavalry could be defeated through feigned retreat, encirclement, and missile fire. It had worked against the Persians at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. It had worked against the Cumans and various Russian principalities in subsequent campaigns. It worked against the Poles and Templars at Legnica in 1241, and it would work against the Hungarians at Mohi 2 days later. The pattern was consistent because the tactic was sound, and the Mongol implementation was excellent. It would keep working until European armies learned to not charge. And that took centuries. The Knights Templar who died at Legnica could not have known any of this. They could not have known that they were fighting the most sophisticated military force on Earth. They could not have known that the tactics they relied on were inadequate for the opponent they faced. They could not have known that their sacrifice would be largely forgotten in the broader sweep of European history. They knew only their duty. The Templar rule was explicit about this. Do not flee from battle. Do not abandon your brothers. Do not abandon the banner. Fight until victory or death. At Legnica, death came for them all. They fought as they had been trained to fight, as generations of Templars before them had fought. With courage, with skill, with faith that God would grant victory to the righteous. But God, if he was watching that April day in 1241, chose not to intervene. The righteous died, the pagans won, and the world kept turning. The smoke eventually cleared from the battlefield at Legnicy Pole. The Mongols collected their plunder and their ears and moved on. The local population emerged from hiding to bury the dead and mourn their losses. And somewhere in France, Templar officials received the news that they had lost men in Poland, including knights who would never return from a battle most Europeans had never heard of. The grand narrative of medieval history continued, shaped by crusades and plagues and political intrigues. The Battle of Legnica became a historical curiosity, a minor engagement in a campaign that ultimately went nowhere. But for the men who fought there, for the Templars who charged into the arrow storm knowing they would likely die, Legnica was everything. It was the moment their courage was tested and found wanting not in quality but in context. They had the misfortune to bring medieval tactics to an early modern fight, and they paid for that misfortune with their lives. 784 years later, we remember them not as failures, but as warriors who did their duty against impossible odds. They fought bravely, they died honourably, and they demonstrated that sometimes courage isn't enough. Sometimes the enemy is just better. The Mongols were better. And on April 9th, 1241 at Legnica, they proved it conclusively.